When Louis XIV died in 1715, his physicians opened his body and found something that stopped them. His stomach was almost double the normal size. Not slightly enlarged, not a little bigger, double. An organ that had been stretched over 77 years of royal eating into something that no longer fit the dimensions of a normal human body. His intestines showed the same, longer than standard, wider, carrying the physical record of decades of excess that no portrait, no painting, no diplomatic dispatch had ever mentioned. The most painted man in the history of France. The man whose image was reproduced on 10,000 objects across the most powerful empire in Europe. And his own body, beneath the silk and the wigs and the gold, told a story that none of those images ever showed. This is the story of what Louis XIV was actually eating at Versailles in 1682. What it cost to produce, what it did to the people who served it, and what it did to the man who consumed it, slowly, publicly, ritually, for 72 years on the throne. Welcome to Unseen Dark Time, where we go to the parts of history that textbooks reduce to a single paragraph and stay there until you understand what it actually felt like. This documentary is built using artificial intelligence reconstruction. If any visual detail appears slightly imprecise, set it aside. The history underneath it is real. There are two things you need to know before we go inside the kitchen. The first is that food at Versailles had almost nothing to do with nutrition or pleasure. It was a performance, a daily theatrical production with one audience and 10,000 cast members. And stopping the performance, even for illness, even for pain, was not an option the king was permitted. The second is that by the time the food reached Louis XIV's table, it had been traveling for 4 hours. What 4 hours does to hot food, that story is coming. First, the scale. The kitchen complex at Versailles in 1682 occupied roughly 1/4 of the entire palace, 55 rooms. 200 men worked in rotating shifts, producing up to 800 meals twice daily for a court that, at its peak, housed 10,000 residents. 6 open fires roasting joints of beef simultaneously. A single boiling cauldron with a capacity of 80 gallons. The largest pastry oven stretched 12 feet across. The annual numbers from the royal accounts tell the rest of the story. Every year, the Versailles kitchen consumed approximately 1,240 oxen, 8,200 sheep, 2,330 deer, 1,870 pigs, 53 wild boar, over 14,000 large animals, before counting the thousands of birds, the barrels of fish, the cartloads of produce arriving daily from the gardens of the Potager du Roi, the royal kitchen garden that André Le Nôtre and Jean-Baptiste de la Quintinie maintained across 9 acres of what had once been a swamp. The annual cost of feeding the court ran to approximately 20,000 livres, somewhere in the range of 6 million modern pounds, every single year without exception. Regardless of whether France was at war, regardless of whether the treasury was solvent, regardless of whether the people outside the palace gates had enough bread. This was not excess as we understand excess. This was architecture. The numbers were the message. Every barrel of wine, every sugar sculpture, every roasted swan carried information. To ambassadors, to visiting dignitaries, to the diplomats whose reports went back to every court in Europe, about the reach and the resources of the French crown. Louis XIV understood this completely. He had been performing it since he was 4 years old. The king ate alone, not privately, not quietly, alone in the specific sense that he was the only person at his table, but in full view of the court, in a ritual called the Grand Couvert, performed several times per week in the salon of Louis XIV, with courtiers standing in prescribed positions observing every bite. You could watch the king eat. You could not eat yourself. The meal began with a procession from the kitchen, a line of servants carrying covered dishes, preceded by officers calling out the king's meat as they moved through the corridors. Every covered dish was accompanied by a taster who had already sampled its contents. Every piece of cutlery had been inspected. Every glass had been handled by a specific officer whose only job was to be responsible for what touched the royal lips. By the time this procession reached the table, the food had been traveling for approximately 4 hours. 4 hours from the kitchen fires to the king's fork, through corridors that were not heated, across courtyards that were open to the January air, through anteroom after anteroom of prescribed ceremony. Every covered dish retained some warmth. Not much. The elaborate sauces that the royal kitchen produced, reductions that took hours to prepare, spiced and sweetened and balanced with a precision that represented the pinnacle of French culinary skill in 1682, arrived at the table at a temperature somewhere between lukewarm and cold. The most powerful king in Europe, served by 200 men in the most sophisticated kitchen ever built, ate cold food every single day. And nobody said anything, because the food was not the point. The procession was the point. The ritual was the point. The performance of abundance, of control, of the infinite distance between the king's table and every other table in France, that was the point. The temperature of the food was irrelevant to the message the food was sending. What was actually on that table? The first course in a formal grand couvert in 1682 included multiple soups, roasted meats, fricassees, ragouts, and a selection of entrees that varied by season and by what the royal hunting parties had brought in that week. Venison was constant. Louis XIV hunted obsessively well into old age, and the game that arrived in the kitchen from his hunts was a source of particular pride. Swan, peacock, and heron appeared at formal meals, roasted and then redressed in their own feathers for display. The cockatrice, a pig's front half sewn to a capon's back half, roasted and presented as a single creature, was a particular showpiece. The second course brought fish, pastries, vegetables, and the elaborate sugar confections that served as both food and architecture. Sugar, imported from French colonial plantations in Martinique and Guadeloupe by 1682, arrived at Versailles in bulk quantities. It was used in cooking, in medicine, in the marzipan sculptures that decorated the sideboard, in the sweetened wine that closed the meal. Drop a comment right now. If you had been a courtier standing in that room, watching the king eat alone in complete silence while you stood observing, what would you have been thinking? And tell us where in the world you are watching from tonight. Every location surprises us, and we read every one. The quantities Louis XIV personally consumed were documented by observers who recorded them with a combination of admiration and quiet alarm. The Duke of Saint-Simon, whose memoirs are among the most detailed accounts of daily life at Versailles, described watching Louis XIV eat 4 full plates of soup, an entire pheasant, a partridge, a large serving of salad, 2 slices of mutton, a plate of ham, pastries, fruit, and hard-boiled eggs, at a single meal. This was not unusual. This was Tuesday. By 1686, Louis XIV had gout in both feet. Gout is caused by the accumulation of uric acid crystals in the joints, a direct consequence of a diet high in red meat, organ meat, rich sauces, alcohol, and sugar, all of which were the primary components of every meal served at Versailles. The condition produces pain of a specific and extraordinary character, a burning, grinding sensation in the joints of the feet that makes walking, and sometimes simply the weight of a bedsheet resting on the affected area, genuinely unbearable. Louis XIV had it in both feet, simultaneously, for years. He continued to eat, not because he was unaware of the connection. His physicians explained it clearly enough. Not because he was indifferent to the pain. The records describe him as suffering from it considerably, but because stopping was not an option that existed within the framework of Versailles. The Grand Couvert was not Louis XIV's dinner. It was France's dinner. The performance of royal abundance was a political instrument that could not be suspended because the king's joints were swollen. The ambassadors who would be dining that evening expected to see the king eat. The courtiers whose entire political existence depended on proximity to the royal person needed to be in that room. The kitchen had been producing this food since before dawn. 200 men had spent 14 hours preparing a meal that the king was going to eat, in pain, in silence, observed by everyone, because the alternative was admitting that the body performing the ritual of absolute power was struggling with the consequences of its own performance. He ate through it, every day. The sugar that went into every course and every medicine and every glass of sweetened wine was doing what it had done to Elizabeth I 20 years earlier, and what it was doing to every wealthy person in Europe who had access to it in quantity. By the 1690s, Louis XIV's teeth had deteriorated so severely that a procedure performed to remove a troublesome upper molar in 1685 had gone wrong. The surgeon, pulling with too much force, removed part of the upper jaw along with the tooth. The king, who could not be seen to flinch in public, sat through the procedure in silence. The wound took months to heal. The opening created by the missing section of jaw meant that food and liquid entered his nasal cavity when he ate and drank, a condition he managed for the rest of his life by specific techniques of eating and swallowing that his attendants learned not to acknowledge. The most observed eater in Europe had developed a way of consuming food that his own body had been partially destroyed. And everyone in the room watched it happen and said nothing, because the ritual required them to watch, and the ritual did not permit comment on what they saw. On September 1st, 1715, Louis XIV died. He was 76 years old. He had been unwell for approximately 2 weeks. Gangrene had developed in his left leg, a complication of the circulatory problems that had been accumulating for years. His physicians had advised amputation. He had refused. He had also, in the days before his death, continued to receive visitors, to conduct business, and, in reduced form, to eat. On August 26th, 5 days before his death, he held a final audience. Contemporary accounts describe him as fully composed. He delivered instructions to the 5-year-old who would become Louis XV. He expressed regret for certain decisions, the wars, the expense, the suffering, with a clarity and a specificity that surprised observers who had expected incoherence. He died the following Sunday, at approximately 8:15 in the morning, as the sun rose over the gardens that Le Nôtre had designed to demonstrate that France could make nature itself obey. The autopsy found the stomach, almost double the normal size, the intestines the same. His physicians recorded the findings with clinical precision, adding marginal notes about the condition of the liver, the kidneys, the heart. The body that had performed the ritual of absolute power for 72 years had kept its own accounting. There is a specific detail about what happened to the Versailles kitchen after Louis XIV died that nobody in 1715 anticipated. The kitchen did not stop. The Grand Couvert continued under Louis XV. The 200 men kept working. The 14,000 animals per year kept arriving. The 4-hour procession kept traveling from the kitchen fires to the cold table. The ritual of royal eating, designed by one king to perform the infinite distance between himself and everyone else, outlasted the king who designed it. It continued until October 1789, when a crowd of 7,000 women walked from Paris to Versailles in the rain, entered the palace, and found the kitchen still running, still producing, still performing the same ritual for a different king in a different century with the same 200 men and the same cold food traveling the same corridors. They found other things too. But the kitchen is the detail that tells you what Versailles actually was. Not a palace, not a garden. A machine for producing a specific performance of power, daily, expensively, without pause, regardless of the body required to perform it or the cost to the bodies required to serve it. Louis XIV's stomach was almost double the normal size. His physicians wrote it down. And then they closed the body, and the kitchen kept running, and the next meal was already in preparation before the ink was dry. The next video in this series goes into the room where Louis XIV held his morning lever, the ritual waking that turned getting dressed into a political instrument. Who was allowed in? Who was turned away? And the one specific morning in 1682 when the order of the ceremony was disrupted by something the records describe with careful diplomatic vagueness, and what that disruption actually meant. Which king or queen's daily routine should we look at next? Drop it in the comments, and tell us where in the world you are watching from tonight. Subscribe to Unseen Dark Time. That next video is already waiting.